Since 1775, U.S. combat deaths for the entire time have been about 666,000 people. And on this Memorial Day, we remember them. But I do have this question for you. How many more will we have to remember next year? The year after that? Over the last several decades, our little skirmishes on one continent or the other have been a few combat deaths here, a few combat deaths there. Even at the height of the fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, the numbers were so small compared to World War II, to the American Civil War. But over the next several years, we're faced with a new kind of war. Not fighting insurgents up in the mountains, not to say that did not take bravery and skill and courage, which it did, and we honor them. But what we're talking about when people start talking about war with Russia or China is a wholly different thing. We are talking about the potential for us to see this 666,000 combat deaths to be doubled in a matter of a year or less. In certain circumstances, we could see that number triple, quadruple in less than an hour. And while we shudder to think about the implications of that, I hope that we do shudder. And I don't think enough people do shudder at the thought of a full-out war with Russia or China, or both. People don't realize how quickly massive U.S. bases could disappear in a literal mushroom cloud. Pearl Harbor, 100,000 military personnel and civilians. This time, if a nuke was dropped on Pearl Harbor, 100,000 soldiers and civilians working for the Department of Defense would disappear. We look at bases that are so very close to Iran, just 150 miles away. Iran being the loose cannon that it is, if it decided to nuke those bases, we'd be losing over 10,000 servicemen, potentially in just a matter of minutes. Ramstein Air Base in Germany, 60,000 Americans on the base. Do you think Russia would attack it? If we got in a shooting war with Russia, do you think they'd hesitate to drop a nuke on 60,000 American personnel, not to mention all the equipment? That would significantly hinder the United States' ability to hit Russia. And that's not even talking about the massive military bases inside the U.S. When we talk about Camp Liberty with 100,000 U.S. soldiers and reservists, Fort Campbell, Fort Benning, I think that's been renamed recently, Fort Lewis, Fort Hood, Bragg. Norfolk itself has 100,000 military personnel and civilian contractors that work there. Not to mention the massive amount of military hardware in the form of massive Navy ships, aircraft carriers. That would almost certainly be a target in any initial attack to bring us to an end. If we lost 100,000, if we just lost one of these bases, we would be looking at the casualties, half the casualties of World War II in one flash. If multiple ones of them were attacked, like I said, in a matter of minutes, we could end up with more combat deaths in an hour-long period than we have had in the last 250 years of U.S. history. And that should be a sobering thought, because this next war will be so much worse than any war that has come before it. World War II was astronomically worse than World War I. And military technology has vastly improved the destructive capability of all the militaries around the world. Just go over to what's happening in Ukraine. It's estimated that Ukraine has lost, and I'm not talking about casualties, this whole thing. We're talking about deaths. Ukraine has been estimated to have lost 150,000 soldiers killed in action. To put that in perspective, that's more than the Union Army lost during the Civil War, which was our greatest amount of casualties and the most number of combat deaths. About 50% of the deaths in the American Civil War were due to disease and other things. Only about half of them were actually combat deaths. And I'm just talking about combat deaths. 150,000 in 2 years have been lost in Ukraine. That's half of what World War II was, but it's closing in on the casualty count that the United States suffered during World War II. That's fighting all across the Pacific, fighting all across Europe, all across Africa. The United States was fighting all around the world, and we had about 50 to 70,000 more combat deaths than Ukraine has suffered in the last 2 years. I know a lot of people are like, what's happening over in Ukraine is not that big. It's kind of their problem or whatever. But it is massive in numbers. And it is a kind of warfare that the United States hasn't faced in a very, very long time, if ever. And so I know a lot of people are just like, China, Russia, whatever. They're paper tigers. If they start pushing buttons and sending missiles around the world, if even one reaches Pearl Harbor, if one reaches Ramstein Air Base, if one reaches Fort Campbell, Camp Liberty, Fort Benning, Norfolk, any of these targets get hit, and we will, in a blink of an eye, have a very different Memorial Day next year. Peace is so important. And we've had president after president after president who have realized that peace with major world powers like Russia, and now we're starting to realize that China is also a world power. We've had these presidents that understood that war was unthinkable. That even if we win it, we lose. We lose so massively that it's not even to be contemplated. But now we have somebody who doesn't care. Because, how much longer is he going to make it anyway? He's surrounded by people who don't seem to care, who don't seem to grasp the fact that as you are playing chicken, you don't play chicken with Russians, okay? It just... Don't do it. And then you look at the honor society of China, where it's not so dissimilar to what we saw in Imperial Japan. And the United States struggled against Imperial Japan because they were so honor-bound. They were so dedicated to serving their emperor and their homeland that they would do anything. And we see that same zealotness, that same zeal inside China today. I know a lot of people will say that's not quite accurate, but the mentality, the culture is very similar. If the Chinese people feel that they themselves as a society have come under attack, whether it's right or wrong, they will fight and they will sacrifice themselves, their individuality, for the greater good like we haven't seen since World War II. When the Chinese came across the border into North Korea to launch their surprise attack against the Americans in the Chosin Reservoir campaign, China said, if you cross the parallel, we will cross the border. And all the Americans said, no, they won't. No, they won't. The Chinese sent 1 million soldiers across the border. Were they the best equipped? Were they the best trained? No, no, no. But there were a whole heck of a lot of them. And they pushed the Americans down to where the DMZ is now today. And if we hadn't stopped the fighting, they could have potentially pushed us out off the continent, out of Asia. Or we could have pushed them back. Suffice it to say that we were not prepared for that. We did not expect that the Chinese would be willing to pay such a high body count. And yet they were. And yet we stand here again on the brink of World War III, and the same morons in Washington, D.C. and everywhere else keep telling us that Russia won't. And that China won't. That it doesn't make sense that they would suffer so many casualties that it just wouldn't be worth it. And yet the simple fact is that we're projecting. I mean, the United States does all sorts of stupid stuff that doesn't make sense. I mean, we've poured how many trillions of dollars into foreign wars and didn't get a dime out of it. That was stupid to the 100th degree. You look at all the places that we helped. We helped Afghanistan, get them beyond the Taliban. Oh wait, who's in charge there now? The Taliban. We said we can't just leave Iraq because Iran will move in. Well, Iran has moved in. We look at, we've made Syria so much better. We've made Libya so much better. So many of the places that we've helped so far have not turned out so well. And yet we've done all these things because we were convinced as a nation that this was a good idea. Are we the only country in the world that does things that are maybe not great ideas? China has been indoctrinated. The nation has been indoctrinated that Taiwan must be unified to the homeland. They've been pounding that drum. Generations of children have grown up knowing that it is essential, an essential point of honor for the Chinese people as a whole. Not just the government, but the people as a whole. For Taiwan to be reunified. And when they endeavor on that great adventure, we're going to send out our aircraft carriers. Our aircraft carriers loaded with 5,000 to 6,000 sailors. Forgive me, Navy people. Sailors. We send some helicopter carriers as well, loaded with 3,000 soldiers and sailors on board. And then we have the support ships. And they're going to be targets. When we can lose as many as we lost in major battles, when we lose one single aircraft carrier, a major naval engagement could show the United States. I mean, when we sail our ships into range of China's medium-range ballistic missiles that are designed to take out U.S. carriers, will we suffer casualties? How many? Are we willing to stomach that? Are we willing to stomach peace and the things that it will cost us to have peace? Or will we say that that's too high of a price to pay for us to sit down at the table and negotiate as equals, to start honoring the whims and the crazy thoughts of other world powers? When Russia said that they will not allow Ukraine to become a NATO puppet, And they said, we will not do anything if you just agree, if you just sign saying that Ukraine will never join NATO. That's all they asked for. Literally all they asked for. And here we are with 300-ish thousand people dead, many hundreds of thousands more wounded, and what for what? Because we wouldn't sign a stupid piece of paper? Could have signed a piece of paper saying they'd never join NATO, but that they would be defended, that all the NATO countries would come to their aid if they were attacked. Could have done that. Could have done that, but no. The guy had too many business contacts, too much corruption to cover up to sign anything like that. And here we are 2 years later, and a nation's been destroyed, and hundreds of thousands of young people's lives have been destroyed because a couple politicians just couldn't actually sit down at a table and actually talk. Couldn't hammer out an agreement. They were ready to just waste these so many lives. I think that we could all agree that World War II was fought on principles and was meaningful. That it had a purpose. There was a reason for it. There was so many attempts made beforehand to avert the crisis. Say what you will about Will Chamberlain, but his understanding of how horrible war was, that anything to avert it was worth doing. Now, was his approach the best? Or was Ronald Reagan's approach the best of strength, peace through strength? I think peace through strength has its merits for sure. But I think that you also have to make sure that your politicians and leaders aren't idiots who are playing chicken with a kind of people that don't understand surrender, that don't understand turning back. We are on a collision course. And I have to ask the question, as we honor the fallen today, how many more will have fallen by next year if we don't keep the peace? And not just soldiers. Pretty much all of these military bases that I've talked about, it's hard to get an accurate number because so many times 50% of the number of soldiers there are family members. Many of these bases have tens of thousands of family members living on base. In World War III, they will be combatants. That's a simple fact, that no one around the world is safe. We have missiles and weapons that can fire around the world. Remember during the Iraq War, the Afghanistan War, that we were having bombers taking off from Missouri and doing bombing runs over there. We regularly did that to the Middle East, in Syria, in Iraq. Aircraft taking off from the continental United States, doing a round trip and coming back home. And we have missiles that can do the same thing. The Russians do, the Chinese do, the Iranians have some pretty long-range stuff too. Friends, World War III is going to look very different. And if we can't get politicians in Europe as well as the United States that understand how serious the threat of looming war is, we are destined not only to repeat what history has shown us, but we will endure suffering like the generations before us didn't even suffer. Friends, I am concerned, and I know you guys are too. I know you are. And I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir. But I can't underscore that we need to remember the sacrifices made by previous generations, but we need to also try to make those sacrifices in this current generation and the coming generations to not be necessary. Will the better angels of humanity prevail? I'm as skeptical as you are. And yet, we must try. All right, friends, thanks so much for joining with us. Please take some time today to honor the fallen, to reflect on it, what has gone before. To those who know people who have lost family members, if you know people who know people who have lost family members, do what you can to reach out to them, bring comfort to them, honor at the grave sites, and many of you have gone to parades already. But let's not forget, and let's hopefully make it so that the next generation doesn't have to pay the price, the similar price or worse price. All right, friends, if you want to check out another video from this channel, there's one right up here. Thanks so much for watching. Steve Poplar of the Poplar Report. Have a happy Memorial Day. Out.